Welcome to episode 15 of It's About Data, the podcast about data, analytics, AI, and whatever else we feel like talking about. Your hosts are Tony Baer of DB Insights and Matt Housley, principal of Halfpipe Systems. This week, we're following up episode 14, where we talked about vendor announcements from the first half of 2025 to talk about high-level themes of the first half of the year, including various themes related to acquisitions, interop, and of course AI and data products, which has been on everyone's lips for several years now. Tony, you want to kick things off?
Sure. Yeah, let's close out the first half of the year, Matt. There are a number of things that, as we were, planning the episode, came up with a number of interesting trends that kind of, kind of like behind the headlines. And let's first, talk about acquisitions. Now, acquisitions have been obviously a continuing saga in this field. It's part of the natural order of things. But there are several interesting ones that, in our segment that actually could presage, I guess, some real changes of direction for several different players. And so, I wonder if you could like to talk about some of them.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these acquisitions align pretty well with the notion that the modern data stack is becoming rebundled, right? So the whole idea of the modern data stack is that we're going to unbundle all these components, and it's a new era. And instead of buying from one vendor or two or three vendors, you're going to buy from 10 vendors or combine open source with several other products. It was kind of the Lego brick stack, right? Like you assemble your own pieces from several different kits to get what you want. And I think what we're seeing with these acquisitions, which frankly, even Joe and I were discussing a couple of years ago, and you've been probably talking with your clients for several years now, is that we're taking those pieces and we're putting them back together. And partially this is because of the investment environment, right? After the Snowflake IPO in 2020, there was just a huge amount of money put into data stacks and components of data stacks. And now that money is kind of drying up, and the big players see an opportunity, they're starting to put all those pieces back together. So what are a couple of these? Data.World got acquired by ServiceNow, I believe it was. And so Data.World is a company that does data cataloging, very sophisticated data catalog. But part of this modern data stack idea of having a separate component for your data catalog. What was another one? Metaplane. So a friend of mine, Kevin, who is one of the co-founders of that company, and Metaplane does data monitoring, basically. And they got acquired by Datadog. And so instead of now just separately monitoring your data stack, you're going to monitor that as part of just your general operational stack. What else? So Neon, Crunchy Data, two Postgres companies kind of rebuilding Postgres databases to do more and exciting things. And those got acquired by which way did the acquisition go? Was it Snowflake,
yeah,
Data? You go ahead.
It's kind of like the Bobbsey twins there.
Right, yeah.
Databricks, acquired Neon, and that actually was a fairly kind of a long fuse in terms of that. Databricks, actually, I think from what I've heard, also Snowflake had invested in Neon, but Databricks had been kind of working towards this with Neon for over a year, and so by the time of Databricks Summit, the acquisition had closed. On the other hand, with Snowflake, acquiring Crunchy Data, that came together from speaking to some of the principals very fast.
Yeah, it was a shotgun wedding, basically.
And they're both aimed at similar purposes. I mean, obviously, Snowflake and Databricks, both very heavily, based in the analytics side.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that both companies have had aspirations to go on the transactional side for some time. I mean, Databricks actually, when we spoke with Ali, he said like one of his original ideas for the company was he wanted to get into transaction processing. But he found initially, especially when his colleagues basically were creating Spark, that there was a gaping need to simplify the data stack for big data processing, for basically data engineering for Hadoop.
Yep.
And so that kind of, so I think they got a little sidetracked for a while, shall we say, sidetracked on the way to $3 billion in revenue. And Snowflake about 3 years ago had announced basically, they didn't announce the product. They announced this is what we're going to work on. They called it Unistore, which is going to be the transaction store.
Yeah.
Now, as far as my take on this initially was that I'm thinking that the transaction processing market is basically pretty mature.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, okay, on one hand, this comes off like a checkbox. Uh, and yes, when you hear Ali talk, basically at the recent summit, he sees this as being part of a new way to architect transaction systems to put them in the same data plane as analytic systems. Of course, we've had hybrid transaction analytics. Gartner and Forrester have each had their names for those platforms. For well,
Right.
Oracle has a converged database, so the idea itself is not new. But we imagine with cloud architecture, where you have different tiers of storage, and you can isolate compute and distribute compute. And also with data sharing, there certainly are some interesting new paths towards that. What I could see from this, early on, one idea is operational analytics. In other words, basically trying to plug in more live data into these
Yep.
platforms. Um, and another is essentially, but I've not heard this from either, as to maybe data sharing. In other words, so we don't have to move data. Now, of course, there are various different. They're all different variants of this. There are alternatives of data sharing. You see, for instance, like with Amazon, they have zero ETL, which is essentially kind of like a CDC, just concurrent replication. They're just so there are a number of different ways to carve this up. But there's another, I think another workload type that might make this also relevant, which is with agents, where agents might be spinning up some ephemeral data stores. And
Interesting.
What's a more logical data store to use than Postgres, which seems to become pretty much. I think they pretty much have supplanted MySQL as becoming kind of the default open source database, partially because it's just such wide adoption, but also that the very nature of the Postgres open source licenses, just don't sue UC Berkeley. Otherwise, kids have at it.
It's very flexible. It's very bulletproof. And I think part of what happened is there was this whole NoSQL movement. There were lots of blog posts written about how SQL is dead. And then it turned out that SQL was not dead, and most web apps went back to being written on traditional transactional row-oriented databases and relational databases specifically. And Postgres was just the default choice, right? It's like, why mess around with other options when this will do basically what you want? And I think Crunchy Data and Neon basically rode on that trend to say, well, okay, we're going to offer nice cloud offerings where we manage things for you. In one case, we make it serverless, so you don't have to deal with a lot of these details that can be operationally a big pain when you're dealing with Postgres. And now with these acquisitions, these are going to become part of someone else's platform, basically.
It's kind of hard to talk about acquisitions this quarter without staring at the elephant in the room, which is Salesforce acquiring Informatica, or what I would say, putting Informatica out of its misery.
That's one way to put it. And this is like the pre-modern data stack in some sense, right?
Yes.
Like Informatica, very new and exciting in the 90s, had developed kind of a stodgy reputation now. And we'll see where they end up under Salesforce management, I guess.
Informatica went through a number of different waves, and actually, up until now, they pretty much mastered the waves. In other words, when they were getting stale, they would update. They
do something
basically new. They changed. They would do 180.
Yeah.
But this last one, they got caught. They were caught after they'd finally gone full cloud SaaS. They got caught totally unprepared for how the modern data stack was really changing, and I think that just kind of put them into it definitely it definitely slowed their growth. It definitely made the companies kind of start to kind of stagnate, and they always had great timing. Not so much this time. If they sold last year, they probably would have gotten about 25-30% more.
Yep. Yeah, just holding out, hoping things would change a bit, but the deal did not change. Markets are very unpredictable and unforgiving, unfortunately, for them.
To me, I see it as basically that Salesforce is trying to essentially buttress its data cloud. Yeah. And this Salesforce has had a number of more rudimentary tools. This can makes that whole data stack potentially far more unified, but also potentially far more monolithic. So I'm not sure how I feel about it.
Yeah, and we'll see. So people who really loved Tableau are not super enthusiastic about how Salesforce has handled that acquisition. There are a lot of things they could have done with Tableau, and it seems like it's sort of being digested Oracle style, honestly. And so will that happen in Informatica, or are they really going to build out a new product around Informatica? That remains to be seen.
Well, on one hand, it's also the human dynamics, which is that when Salesforce acquired Tableau, job prospects for developers and computer scientists, were much greater than they are today. So there is that they may not have the same brain drain, obvious, or that may not be one of the issues that they face on this go around. Another thing we keep talking about with acquisitions about basically compressing the modern data stacks is data stacks.
That's
IBM
true.
buying data stacks.
Yeah. And I'm not clear if that's been finalized or not, but it's definitely been announced.
It has been.
It's official. Okay.
It just closed a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. And I think you were saying that the big motivation for that one was actually not Cassandra necessarily, but OpenSearch, right?
Yeah, OpenSearch and also LangFlow. And evidently from those projects, what surprised me, I spoke with some of the data stacks folks, and they've actually drawn their developer community is actually they've drawn a 250,000 new developers as a result of these projects, which really surprised the heck out of me. That to me is what I see as being it was definitely a surprise. I don't see Cassandra as really being the driver of this, frankly, but there are some certain technologies that basically that hook into that, but can hook into basically almost any type of data stack as opposed to data stacks. So that's potentially potentially interesting. But anyway, let's move on here. And this kind of gets into, we sort of touched on this, with regard to with the acquisitions, which is about data engineers. Are they still relevant? And Matt, or I should ask, Matt, this is awfully personal for you, ain't it?
Well, it is. And I'm going to broaden it and not just talk about data engineers. I'm going to talk about software engineers, architects, like all of these high skill, very technical positions that have made extremely large salaries in Silicon Valley and in other companies for a long time. And the salaries up to 2020, I would say through maybe 2022, just kept rising and rising. I mean, from between 2015 and 2020, I think in some cases the salaries maybe doubled for similar positions.
Yeah.
It was quite a ride. And now we're in a layoff wave. There are some real existential questions. I think my opinion right now is that the management class always likes to lay people off, right? Let's be frank. I think we've seen this again and again. And you go back to the 80s to now. Any chance they get to lay people off, especially these expensive technical positions, they like to do that. I'm not so convinced that this is really the final state of the industry. I think that the AI tools are going to prove very useful, but I think also we're in an era of accumulating tech debt. I think that's the reality. All this vibe coding stuff. I think the people have been criticizing this for a while, saying, okay, you can build working systems. That's great. Are they maintainable? Are they secure? And I think the evidence we're seeing right now is that they're probably not. And at some point, those chickens are going to come home to roost. Now, what does the new final state, well, it's never final, but the new state of engineering look like in 5 years? That I'm much less certain about. But I suspect that there will be a movement to rehire a lot of experts at high salaries to fix some of the problems that we're creating at the moment. I don't think Gen AI is mature enough to fully build systems. I think it's mature enough to do individual commits, although in those cases, some of those are also highly questionable. I think it's mature enough to be a very useful tool, but I don't think we're at equilibrium right now. So we shall see.
I'm wondering if what you're really saying here is that software engineers have to start adding more architectural,
I think that's true, because I think there was I agree with you on that, and I think there was even in data engineering there were a lot of people kind of acting as code monkeys, like build this report, build this pipeline, and just doing these very simple tasks, often badly, frankly. I mean, I think that's mea culpa for the entire profession. I think there was a lot of just like code slinging, building things quickly and sloppily. And I agree. I think there has to be more of a systems orientation, more focus on security, more value add for the full organization. And, we're probably not going to be needing quite as many engineers as we did, and the salaries are probably going to be somewhat lower. But I think this layoff wave will be succeeded by a hiring wave at some point to patch up some of the problems that we're creating at the moment. I think it's also interesting, if LLMs were so good, then we also wouldn't need machine learning engineers, right? And we wouldn't need people working on LLMs. But what did we hear with this ongoing kind of verbal fight between Mark Zuckerberg and OpenAI over the last week? Well, there were these efforts to lure talent from OpenAI over to Meta, and in some cases, $100 million bonuses, supposedly. So that tells me that engineers are still relevant. We're going through a phase where traditional software engineering and data engineering are not so cool anymore, and we're getting layoffs in those areas. But if you happen to shift over into one of these other domains, then you may be able to fetch a very high salary right now from Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg, basically.
Yeah, let's, as our eyes are starting to see dollar signs, let's set to our last topic, which is, it gets something really boring, like data products.
Yes, data products. So reading Zhamak Dehghani's original book on data mesh, one of my critiques at the time was that she's not very clear on how you should manage all these individual teams. She pushes a very decentralized agenda, which I think is a great idea, and she pushes this kind of move left idea of let the software developers also handle data. Fantastic. I agree with all of that. But then she's very vague on whether you should have common data systems across all these teams. And that was one thing that I immediately rejected, because I've seen how this goes in organizations if you let each team do their own thing. What you want is each team to own its own data, but to have a common stack and say, okay, we're going to all use Spark. We're going to have a central center of excellence that helps us manage Spark, because the reality is that most software engineers are not experts in analytics data. And if you just let them do their own thing, you're going to have a huge mess. And so I think we're seeing a recognition of that more broadly. So first of all, Zhamak herself has a company that works on this problem of having standardized components for data mesh and for data products. Next Data, right, is her company. But I think also we're seeing a lot of other vendors push the same idea, like do data mesh, have separate data products coming from different teams, but we're going to help you to manage access control. We're going to use common components so you don't have to build your own systems. You're just going to use a standardized call SQL queries, call Spark, whatever you want to do, but we'll have a central team that provides that for you. Maybe you can tell us more about what the vendors have announced in this regard.
Well, put it this way, I'll remark very briefly. I sat through the opening announcement of when Next Data basically introduced its actual product. In other words, now we actually have product, and it was so complicated, and there were so many moving parts that it scared the heck out of me.
Okay.
In other words, like, what could go wrong? In other words, I kind of thought like this was probably a little too overly thought out. And so I'm very nervous about that approach. But more to the point, I think, and we've had a lot of conversations in the past about data mesh, and my own take on it was that one was kind of back, to what you're saying in terms of you need some common standards. I really said, like, don't even think about data mesh unless you have some sort of data fabric. So it's sort of like that same idea. In other words, you need some sort of common metadata backbone and some sort of common, basically, way of harmonizing how you deliver data. So that's number one. And number two, I was very cynical about the idea of something like that being applied across an entire diverse organization. I think we're something like that where you start to get really, my work would be with groups that have some sort of shared context. So that could be basically groups that know each other personally and or work in related areas. Otherwise, I just did not see data mesh itself as being terribly scalable. On the other hand, I think the one thing that has emerged from from data mesh has been the data product. The idea of thinking of data as a holistic entity that's managed across its life cycle. And that's not to say that all data assets should be managed that way. And I've seen something some very interesting moves from IBM and SAP that highlight that in terms of if you have some certain premium assets of data that may also that data encapsulates very complex processes. Or if you try, especially in the case of SAP, which has complex data structures and complex processes, underneath it, SAP now in their business data cloud is exposing SAP data products, and that makes a hell of a lot of sense to me. IBM also, through Watson X Data Intelligence, they include a capability called Product Data Hub. They're not necessarily saying that all your data should be should be managed as products, but there are going to be certain high value data assets that that should be, and that's so. In other words, they're not trying to take like a one size fits all approach. I see that as basically I see that as essentially kind of the path on how we're going to approach data products.
Yeah. And frankly, from my perspective, also having the notion of the cloud data warehouse has really been a big enabler for data products. And I'm talking these modern systems that mimic kind of the stodgy systems, right? So I'm talking about BigQuery, Snowflake, Databricks, specifically their data lakehouse capability, where it's meant to be like a traditional data warehouse. Those are, each team can kind of have their own little domain without needing common hardware or someone to monitor common hardware. That was always the problem in the past. You buy a contract with Oracle, it's very expensive, and you have this big, box sitting somewhere, this server rack. None of that is required anymore. So each team can have their own data that then gets shared to these other teams in a very simple way. And I think it's very similar to what you're talking about with SAP and IBM.
Exactly.
And we'll see where that evolution goes, because we need the organizational evolution in parallel with the technology evolution. And I think that's happening now.
There's one question about.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
Go finish your remark, and then I want to loop back to interop, which we kind of skipped over.
Well,
and we'll close out with that.
Okay, gotcha. Which is that. This is why I see the importance of data catalogs lurking in lake houses.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Back to interop.
Interop. So high level theme with interop is that, and we kind of mentioned this last episode. In the past, I think the hyperscalers wanted to own everything. If you went to AWS, they wanted to own every workload, and increasingly, the cloud companies and the traditional ones like SAP are acknowledging, hey, we need to play nice with other people, right? And that is Oracle, for example, locating their hardware inside of other clouds. That is the cloud vendors increasingly playing nice with the traditional vendors and offering their products. And I think that's where we're headed, right? Like, I think there's a realization even amongst the heavyweights like Azure and AWS that you're not going to own everything, right? And so you need to figure out how to play nice with other people. And that trend is just going to continue from here.
Yeah, I think the real, the one that was the real pivotal moment. Well, obviously, 5 years ago when Oracle and Microsoft, inked basically their, initially the interconnect. It's like, who saw that coming? It's almost like the enemy of the enemy. The rationale, but basically what it meant was that a lot of Oracle customers, use Microsoft in the front office, and what they saw was just a huge, sort of synergy there, and that relationship, how it evolved, kind of set the pattern from all this. The big shocker was Oracle and AWS, because these two have been at loggerheads, and to have seen Larry Ellison, and Matt Garman on the same stage, talking nice to each other, guardedly but nice, was quite a moment. And I would expect in the second half of this year, we're going to be hearing a lot more about that relationship.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, but I almost have the impression that AWS thought that it could kill Oracle at some point. Just like stick it out, and eventually we'll be able to kill Oracle. And arguably, Amazon helped to kill Sun, right? Like, there were many things that killed Sun. But when Amazon basically said in the early 2000s, we're ripping out all of our Sun OS and we're replacing that with Linux, a lot of other things had happened that had hurt Sun, but that was kind of the death knell where things really started to go downhill. And then Sun got acquired by Oracle for pennies on the dollar compared to their peak valuation.
Right.
And I think Amazon thought they would do the same thing to Oracle. And it turns out that Oracle is very, very resilient, and they have made a lot of savvy moves, and they're probably going to be around for the long haul, just like Amazon.
There are, keep in mind, through all this, there's still a lot of database differentiation. And the other fact, I mean, yes, Amazon did move off of Oracle databases. It took them 10 years to do it. And not all, and for them it was very strategic. It also was part of the strategy, to develop their own database platforms. But most organizations are not Amazon.
No, and I think part of this was frankly a marketing effort behind RDS and other database products running
Sure.
on Amazon, and now there's an acknowledgement that wasn't maybe a great strategy. Like we have lots of customers on RDS, but we still have customers who want to run Oracle on AWS, and if you want those customers on your platform, you just have to support Oracle, and so we need to play nice, and we need to figure out the licensing together and not be so adversarial. Basically.
Yeah, there are a lot of compromises you have to make when you do a commercially licensed database like Oracle or SQL Server on RDS that don't. I mean, where RDS really shines is with open source because you don't have
exactly
those
right
constraints. And so that essentially, with Oracle, with basically, Oracle OCI inside Exadata machines, essentially inside AWS and Google and Azure. Essentially, everybody wins on that one.
Yeah. And there's kind of an acknowledgement, frankly, on Larry Ellison's part that Oracle Cloud is not going to crush the hyperscalers anytime soon. It's going to be around, but it's probably not going to be a huge player. So let's play nice.
Well, actually, it's a pretty sizable player within the hyperscalers. And the thing is that they do certain things that the hyperscalers do not do. Okay, yes, the others do databases, but the hyperscalers do not do ERP apps.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And they're not going to get all those migrated to their hardware. So just let the Oracle hardware come in, let Exadata onto your premises, onto your server farm, and hopefully we can play nice together and live in harmony in the future.
Well, that's a lot to think about.
That is.
And I think right now, we need to save the rest of fireworks for 4th of July.
Agree. We'll shut this down. Okay. Thank you, Tony, for another episode. Good. We'll talk to you soon.
Good talking.
Take care.